it's after, more than 5 after already. Okay, let's go ahead and get started on theory. More people aren't showing up. So this is our third workshop in the web development series, Introduction to Web Design for Literary Theorists. And I'm going to give you, what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you a quick review of a couple major concepts from the last two workshops. And then we'll talk about our primary topic for the day, which is how do we make web pages more easily intelligible to other machines as well. And there are a number of benefits to that we'll talk about. One is that your web pages are necessarily, if you put them on the internet, already going to be processed by machines to some extent. And one example, probably the clearest example of that for most people, is that, of course, your web pages will be indexed by search engines eventually. But there are a number of other ways that you can make your web pages more easily parsable by machine processors. And there's, again, a couple of benefits to that we'll be talking about. So, again, what are we actually doing in this workshop series? The idea is that you'll learn the basic skills that would be necessary to build a small website that gives you an opportunity to distribute course materials to students and to make your web presence more visible on the web, with an eye to things like, will this be easily searchable when I'm looking for a job? So this third workshop is particularly targeted to that. How can we make your web presence more visible in ways that are productive for you when you're trying to increase your overall visibility? So for our last two workshops, what I've been arguing rather extensively actually is that although it's possible to write HTML in a way that is presentational, that basically just treats treats HTML as if it were a word processor, that this is a bad idea. And part of the second workshop was an argument that one reason for that is that it's actually much more work in terms of maintaining your website, and that rather than using tags that indicate, say, what font you're using, or what the font size should be, or whether something is bold, it's better to mark up the text semantically, because what you can then do is just attach a style sheet that's tied to the semantics of your own markup practices in order to make changes consistently. But the other half of that argument is that if you properly use semantic markup, that makes your web pages more easily parsable by machines as well as humans, and that there's a number of things that you should do. Just to use one example, you have a title at the top of probably almost any document that you write. Usually you should use the H1 tag, the top level header tag, to mark up that title instead of just saying that it's bold and in 24-point Arial, because not only is that a good practice, but one of the reasons that that's a good practice is that Google takes, when it's indexing your pages, takes that as a clue to what the page is really about. If you mark it up as this is the top level header, rather than as this is in 24-point bold Arial centered. So there's a number of things that we'll be talking about today. One of those is there's some additional tags that I've kind of glossed over that you can use, particularly for the heading of your document. And you'll notice, you may recall that I said in the first workshop that the standard for how web pages are evaluated, how HTML documents are parsed, requires only one thing in the header tag, which is a document title. And that's the document title that's usually displayed in the title bar of the web browser. But there's a number of things that you can put in there that aren't displayed to users that you can think of productively as hints for machines that are processing. Some other topics we'll be talking about today. Microformats are a way of embedding little clues in your document saying that are intended for machine parsers and not for human parsers. So what those essentially do is to make a declaration that says something along the lines of, hey machine, this bit of text is about a person or about an event, or any number of other topics. This is a review, this is a recipe. We'll be focusing primarily on two microformats, although there's nearly a dozen, and looking briefly at a third, all of which are really easy to write. We'll also be talking about sitemaps, which are explicitly a way of providing hints to search engines about the relative value of your pages compared to each other on a single website, and that can help them find web pages that they may not be able to find just by crawling links on your site. We'll be talking about Open Graph, which is a Facebook-driven standard for how do you indicate to social networks what's important about this web page if somebody shares it on their social network. It's also supported by Google Plus and LinkedIn. And we'll be talking about some miscellaneous things that Google likes for purposes of displaying search results to various people. Or when they display your page as a search result, you have some control over how exactly that's going to be displayed. A lot of these items kind of dovetail with each other, so that there's a comparatively small number of basic concepts. And as always, there's a lot of details that I'm going to be moving over really quickly. What I want for you to get is not necessarily every single detail, but rather basic concepts. And feel free to ask questions if you have any as we go along. And as always, it's absolutely okay to come talk to me. That's part of the reason why I have lead TA office hours. You would not be the first person to just bring in your laptop and work through something over this quarter. So just a reminder, what is HTML? HTML is a standard language for displaying content on websites. It's just an HTML file is just a plain text file that is enhanced with markup, what we call tags, that indicate the structure of the document to machines that process it in some way. Of course, anytime somebody is looking at your web page, any web page that you write, almost without exception, they're not looking directly at the HTML code. They're looking at the result of processing that HTML code in at least one type of machine. And again, we've been focusing exclusively on browsers so far, but what I want to emphasize at this point is that that is, of course, also a type of machine processor, in addition to the ones that we'll be talking about today. And again, I want to emphasize that it's important to think about your web page design process in terms of writing HTML that describes structure rather than appearance. That means separating content from information about how content should be presented. And again, controlling the appearance of a web page is really the function of CSS rather than HTML. So I want to take a look again at our minimally acceptable HTML document that we developed during the first workshop. Right? What does it actually have? Well, the actual stuff that is visible to the user is the title in here, which is to say that appears in the title bar of the web browser if the user is using a web browser that renders things visually, and then has a small amount of text in a single paragraph. And again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is simply that the tagging that I'm using is semantic rather than presentation. The HTML tag is what's called the root tag of the entire document. That is, everything else is a descendant of the HTML tag. Head is a descendant. Head is an immediate child of HTML, as is body, and title is an immediate child of head, as well as being a further descendant of the HTML tag. This similar comments could be made about all of the tags inside of the body. So, I was reading The Sound and the Fury again last week because I was teaching it to students, and it occurs to me that this is actually a pretty good metaphor in many ways for how Google sees any web page that you write. And if you think about your first experience reading The Sound and the Fury, or if you think about the experience of the average undergraduate who encounters it for the first time and doesn't know what to make of it, like the kinds of reading practices that they engage in are not all that different from what Google does when it sees any text anywhere on the web, right? What does it know? It knows that there's a bunch of words and that they are in some sense connected, and that, there are semantic things going on that are not immediately transparent on the first glance, and that interpreting The Sound and the Fury requires probably more than one reading for almost anyone, and certainly for me, that in order to understand what's going on, to a certain extent, you also have to understand what's going on, and that there's a large vocabulary that you yourself may not be perfectly familiar with, right? What's a blue gum, for instance? So Google has the same kind of reaction to pretty much any piece of text. That is to say, it knows that there's a bunch of words. It knows that they have a semantic structure, and it sort of understands that, but it doesn't necessarily, well, I don't even want to say necessarily. Google probably never genuinely understands what the page is about, quote unquote. So what you need to do, and this is all I'm really trying to emphasize here, is that it's necessary to provide it with additional clues, as Faulkner does, for instance, right? That one of the things that he does in Benji's section here is indicate time shifts and other changes of attention by starting or abandoning italics, by doing other linguistically semantic things in the realm of human readable text. So, I guess the question is, why go to any trouble at all to be nice to the machines that are processing your text? Because any amount of effort is arguably too much, right? And I think that there's a fair argument to be made that after all, you don't really care whether Google organizes and finds and properly understands your web page, because the web pages that you develop for, say, section website are intended for your students. And this is an absolutely fair argument. And there's, out of all the things that we're going to be talking about today, I think that it's entirely possible to say that you don't need to do any of this. None of this is mandatory. None of it is required for your document to have any kind of formal validity. But being nice to machines has several advantages to you. And one is that, in many ways, it's also helpful to your users in various ways. And I mean that not just in the assholey kind of, everybody, of course, wants to see my web page, and it is a service to provide it to the world, so I'm going to make it more intelligible to search engines, but also that there are directly attainable benefits, or there are directly tangible benefits to people in a lot of ways, especially the tech-savvy ones. As I suggested earlier, there's a number of ways in which engaging in a little bit of extra markup beyond what's required just to display your page correctly enhances the visual appeal of the way that your document is processed by other machines. And again, our primary examples here are search engine results and sharing on social networks. And the other thing is that, like any constituency, machines like it when you are nice to them and pander to their preferences. And that although there's a great deal of debate about whether, say, Google takes the X and Y factors into account while deciding what goes towards the top of the list on search engine results, it certainly can't hurt to give it some information about the actual structure of your documents that's specifically intended for it. So I want to talk about some additional stuff that can go in your document's head. Remember that every document has a head and a body, and the contents of the head are basically invisible to the users, except for the title, which appears in the title bar of the document. But there's two other major tags that you'll see in the header sometimes, and one of those is link. All link really means is there's another document that's required to properly understand, in some sense, what this HTML document is about. And one example that you saw in Workshop 2 is that if you have a style sheet that, where do you put the information about an external style sheet? You put it as a link in the, noticing a typo in my own slideshow there. You put it as a link in the head of the document. So in this example, what do you have? You have several attributes for the link tag. Rel just indicates the relationship of the link to the rest of the page. There are about 80 bazillion different things you could plausibly put there that would be understood, but style sheet is by far the most common. What kind of a style sheet is it? Well, you're giving it what's called a MIME type, technically, which may very well be a phrase that you're familiar with. But it's a CSS style sheet, which is in fact text. And the href is just the location of a CSS document somewhere on the server. But there are other ways for HTML documents to depend on other documents, and actually the link is not the more important of the two tags that you can have in the header. But we will be talking about several additional places where you use it later this morning. Probably by far the more common tag and the more significant one is the meta tag, which, as you might expect, encodes meta information about your document. Again, this is information that's not directly visible to users, but this provides way of providing hints of various kinds to machines. What kinds of information can you legitimately put in the meta tag? Anything you want. And so it's not at all uncommon to find people putting in things like the name of the document author, when it was last modified, things like that. There is no authoritative, definitive list of what vocabulary you can use to describe this information, but there is a kind of a very broad consensus about what people actually do in practice. And you're welcome to expand that as much as you'd like for your own purposes, provided that you understand that, machines are dumb, and that if it's not something that they're programmed to be looking for, they won't be looking for it. If you find useful information there anyway, then, you're welcome to put anything there you want. So here's some examples that I just ripped off of one of my web pages. You'll notice that the syntax of the meta tag generally contains two attributes, a name and a value, right? Or rather a name and a content. Basically, these are name value pairs. So with the meta tag, you might have the name indicate author, meaning what is this information? It's the author. Content might then be the actual name of the author. Copyright might be a copyright notice. Again, a very broadly implemented practice. You'll notice that you can add keywords to your header of your document. What are keywords for? Hard to say. It used to be a very common practice to put them in, and it used to be the case that search engines actually took this into account when they were deciding what it was they were going to, or how they were going to rank documents. And the problem was that by the late 90s, the keywords meta tag had been so abused that search engines have stopped looking at it entirely. There probably are other pieces of software that still use it in one way or another when processing text automatically, but honestly, I couldn't find any when I went looking for some last night, or I couldn't find an example of how the keywords are actually used in any way by anyone. Description might very well just be some description, right? Again, there are ways to display this to users, and maybe one of the better ideas here would be to just pull up a web page and take a look at them. That is not actually the document I wanted to bring up. Let's try that again. Okay. So here we have an HTML document. All of this stuff, again, is from that's actually rendered in the browser itself, is actually from the body, except for the title of the document. However, if I want to take a look at the meta information in Firefox, I can always go to View Page Info, and here's all of the meta tags. You have the generator, is a commonly used meta tag for what program was used to actually write the HTML. You have author, copyright, description, the date that the file was last modified. You have an indication here of exactly what the content of the document is. And so in this case, all I'm really indicating is that this is the MIME type for an HTML document, which is perhaps not all that interesting. But this is also commonly used as a way to tell machines that are in one way or another processing your text what kind of encoding you're using. As you probably know, what is a text file? Well, it's just a file that is an arbitrary sequence of numbers like any file, but by convention we've agreed to decide that certain numbers map onto certain letters. There are literally hundreds of such different conventions indicating which numbers are supposed to be taken to be which letters, and the machine needs to know which one is actually in use here. By default, if you don't know which encoding you should be using, then by far the best choice is 8-byte Unicode. If you have a specific reason for using something else, then you'll already know what that is. But UTF-8 is just the short name for 8-byte Unicode. Again, most of this information is not all that useful to users most of the time, but it is in fact possible to bring it up and look at it. It's interesting rehearsal practice out there. There are times where you might want to indicate to machines which human-readable language is actually being encoded in the document. And, I mean, there are any number of reasons why that might be handy, not just to machines, but to users. It is, of course, handy to machines, such as, say, search engines, so that they can know that if someone is using maybe not google.com, but google.de in German, that chances are that person is more likely to be interested in finding documents that were written in German than were written in English. And so it's actually surprisingly difficult to auto-detect which natural language is used for a machine. Or it's surprising, what I'm trying to say is it's hard for a machine to auto-detect which natural language is being used, even though they seem so different to people. Again, to machines, they all kind of look like the Sound and the Fury. So indicating which natural language you're using is helpful to Google when it's trying to figure out which documents to display in response to a search query. It may also be helpful to users in various ways, right? That if you are, if you have a page that accepts form submissions, for instance, and gives users a chance to type things in and submit them, then indicating what language you expect those to be in will trigger at least some web browsers to make a determination of which language they should be using when they spell check the user's document. Or it may be that a user imports a web page into Microsoft Word, right? In which case the information comes through already tagged with which language is being used, so that when they spell check it, Word can use an appropriate language dictionary to spell check that document. The short version of how do you indicate the natural language that your content is written in is that you can add the lang attribute to any HTML tag at all. And it's an incredibly common practice to just apply the lang tag, the lang attribute to exactly one tag, and that's the body. And so here you have body language equals EN, which is of course English, right? And all that really means is that everything in the document is in English. It may very well be that if you're switching language, that you may want to be more specific about which version of English you're actually writing in. And so for me, most of the time I write in American English, you know. And so it's possible to be more specific. And I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a desired practice, to have a less specific one on the body and the more specific one on individual paragraphs. That's absolutely not necessary. I'm just indicating different ways of marking up which language is being used. So you'll notice that here we have a standardized code, the ISO 639.2 code, if you want to be specific, for which language is being used. And you can look up a complete list of all languages that are understood by browsers. And then there's a region, right? English as spoken in the US. And then it may very well be that somewhere along the line you switch languages, right? What I'm talking about here is English as spoken in Ireland, which is what IE is a code for. These codes are often, but not quite always, the same as top-level domain codes. So if you already knew that .ie is for Ireland, websites in Ireland, you would know that. And so what I really have here is that I'm just applying a language attribute to the Q tag, which of course is for quotes. The browser understands, if it's trying to process natural languages at all, that when the Q tag is over, so is the use of English as spoken in Ireland. There's generally no particular need to be any more specific than you need to be. That is to say, don't go out of your way to be more specific. If you're talking about Japanese, there's really only one country in the world where you have a substantial portion of people who speak Japanese by default as their native language in a way. I guess that's not actually what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that people who speak Japanese generally speak it in most circumstances as it's spoken in Japan already, right? That that there is not a substantial proportion of people in, say, Canada who speak Japanese in a wildly divergent way from the way in Japan. So, generally speaking, it's not necessary to indicate that you mean Japanese is spoken in Japan. It's good enough to indicate that the language is Japanese. Does that make sense? Okay. Not to belabor the point there. But, moving on and switching topics. What we're talking about here with microformats is just a way to embed short pieces of machine-readable data into your web page for certain very specific circumstances. Microformats are in some ways conceptually related to some bigger, heavier weight web development and text processing capabilities like RDF. And if you're familiar with rich data format, then you know that it takes a really long time to learn, because RDF is, among other things, an attempt to set up machine-readable vocabulary that could theoretically describe almost anything, right? And so, of course, RDF is very complex. Microformats are not. They're designed to solve specific problems by making specific pieces of data visible to machines. So, examples of this, there's ways to mark up identity information. In fact, Google says that out of all the information that's marked up specifically to be machine friendly, more than half of it is just people marking up identity information in some form. Calendar information. You can talk about relationships. What is your relationship to someone else that you're linking to? You can talk about recipes. There are microformats for indicating reviews. So basically what a microformat is just a way of pointing at a piece of data and yelling, "Hey machine, here it is," so that the machine can find it easily. Reminder here that there are some attributes that you can put on any tag, right? You can give any tag an ID. You can give any tag a class. You can give any tag a lang attribute to indicate what language it's in. One of these, you'll notice that when I initially talked about this, I said that you can do this for any purpose of your own. That's true. You can attach a class to something for any reason at all that you want to. However, there are some ways of using classes that are particularly common, and one is attaching classes to tags so that you can then style elements of that class. So for instance, I often create a class, or I create a class in a default style sheet that's used by basically all pages on my website called book title. And I then define, when I mark something up as a book title, it then appears in italics. But marking it up for purposes of styling is not the only reason to mark up a tag with a class. And probably the quickest way to indicate another common use is to say that there are common vocabularies that are relevant to questions of how machines parse documents. So, just to give you one example, HCard is a microformat standard that's described on microformats.org that indicates to machine parsers that you are in some way talking about a person. So just to give you a specific example, if I can get stuff to open up, good. I'll go ahead and skip the doc type here because I don't want to look it up. I might very well have an About Me section of my website that might look something like this. Just looking for my own profile address. Let's see how often I use Google Plus these days. Not often. Nope, that's settings. What I really want is to... Where's my profile? Here. Yes? No. View profile. It's the big blue button. Awesome. So here's the address for my Google Plus profile, which is really all I wanted out of this rather cumbersome detour here. Information with properly marked up HTML document. If I'm concerned about it, I can put some styling information in the head rather than in an external style sheet. To indicate that anytime I mark something up with the class book title, it should be displayed as italic. Everything looks good. I should probably give my document a title in the body. Now this is not particularly exciting, but it gives you the elements of what you might have in an About Me kind of a web page. And I might as well fix a typo, as long as I'm here. So what does it mean to mark something up semantically so that a machine can find it? Well, in order to do so, what you need to do is to take this information and add a certain amount of structured information using the H-card standard. So what does that mean? It means you have to find the element that contains all of the information that you intend to mark up as part of the identity information. Despite the fact, and then you apply a specific class name to it. Despite the fact that the standard name is itself H-card, the root class name, so-called root class name, for this element is V-card. So what I'm going to do is decide that all of my information appears in this paragraph. If I had multiple paragraphs and all of them contained some information, I might very well just wrap those paragraphs with a div. And I'll add another paragraph just for the sake of illustrating this. So what I've done now really is I've indicated that this information falling within this div is in fact an H-card. I haven't done it yet well. I haven't done it well yet because I haven't yet marked up some of the required sub-information, but this is the first step. So what do I need to do? The only absolutely required piece of information is you have to indicate what the name of the person you're talking about is. How do you do that? By wrapping spans around it with a specific class name. That's really all I absolutely have to do to be compliant. This is not the most useful way to do this, because after all, what good does it actually do people? Or what good does it actually do machine parsers if all I indicate is my own name? Still, this is, on the face of it, already a minimal H card. And to show you that, I'm taking a look at the operator Firefox extension that I've asked people to install. And what operator does is it just looks at microformats in web pages that you're looking at and exposes them to browsers. So all I'm really showing here is that I have a microformat and that there are a number of things that I can do with it. In particular, I can export a vcard from it, which is a standard machine parsable kind of a text file, basically, that you could add to, say, your email address book. I'm not going to go ahead and do that now. But talking about other things that I might want to mark up that appear on here, well, I can mark up my address. This is not a properly formatted postal address, but it is in fact an address. And so I can mark up here using the standard vocabulary ADR that this is in fact my address. If I have more complicated names, or if I have names that are in a non-Western format where you do not have the personal name preceding the family name, then I can mark up the individual names of my individual elements of my name. Again, given name is the standard vocabulary here. And the standard vocabulary here is family name. And for anything that comes after the name, you might legitimately use honorific suffix. Remember that I need to close every span that I open, as with any other tag. And so what you'll find is that if you start marking up a whole lot of information, the HTML gets a lot less human readable. There's a number of things that you can do to help ameliorate this problem. One is, if you're doing things like this, you should always run them through the validator service that the World Wide Web Consortium provides, because you want to make sure that you haven't forgotten to close any tags. Because if you close any tags, then it will be difficult for your HTML to be parsed by machines. So, there's a number. Yeah, okay. There's a number of problems that I have that the validator is complaining about. Primarily, what it's complaining about is simply that I haven't declared a doc type, so I'll go ahead and do that to make it more parsable. And let's try validating again. Character encoding found, and again, that's one of those things that the validator will in fact complain about. So I'll go ahead and declare one. And again, that's done in the heading. And the validator has gotten awfully picky about declaring a certain number of mandatory attributes. I'm not sure why the validator is not currently accepting this. I would like to say that I would hope it's a problem with the validator, but honestly I'm probably missing something simple. Let me try something else, just for the sake of moving on. How embarrassing. Of course it worked. Last night, when I was running through this initially. Okay. Unfortunately, my initial point was just that if I forget to close one of the spans or other elements, that winds up making up the definition of the micro format, then the validator will catch it. So if, for instance, I'd forgotten to close this last span indicating an honorific suffix, then what the validator will actually warn me about is, it says you're closing the P tag, but you haven't closed everything between it, everything else, and that you're missing a closing for a span that was open. So if I put that back in, it will properly validate. Again, simple principle is, if you open it, you have to close it, or it has to be a self-close tag that doesn't contain any information. Another way to deal with this problem is to remember that HTML collapses whitespace, and you can use that to your advantage in any way that you'd like. And so if I am trying to figure out, especially with more complex microformats like HResume, which contains a lot of information with data that contains other data that contains other data, what I wind up doing is every time I open something, I start a new line while I'm trying to debug it. And again, typically, when I'm writing my own code, I indent inside of divs. So what I do here is I'm opening the FN span, and what I might do as I'm writing that is, or if I'm trying to debug it, is, well, one thing is that Bluefish, that I like about Bluefish and other HTML editors, is that they do syntax matching. So what Bluefish is telling me here is that for this tag that I have positioned my cursor at the beginning of, it highlights it in red, and it also highlights the closing tag in red, the matching end tag, which makes life a little bit easier. But sometimes what I'll do when I'm trying to debug problems here is just replace everything usefully that can usefully be replaced with spaces, or all spaces that can usefully be replaced with returns. And so that makes it easier for me to visually see I have here a span that contains other spans. I can leave this way and it'll render just fine, but if I'm worried about, as you can see, it renders just fine. And again, reminder that white space generally gets ignored. Notice that this is in fact all on one line. The problem here that you're seeing is that there is, in fact, some white space between the end of this period and the end of the sentence, which is why I left the period there. That means before I actually use this HTML document or upload it to the web, I may very well just want to do this. On the other hand, I may also just want to remove that second period, which doesn't semantically belong there according to the rules of English. Other stuff, there's a number of other things that you can in fact mark up with HCard as to indicate that these are part of your identity card that you're providing for the parser on the web page. And it might be that one other thing I want to put on there is a photo. And so if I can quickly find a photo of myself, which is possibly not all that easy, I guess I can just use the URL of my Google Plus photo here. You'll see this. Again, I could make this much more attractive if I wanted to spend a couple minutes playing with the styles, but that's not our main purpose here. So one of the things that you may note is that when I'm marking this information up with spans, what I'm saying actually is the information that corresponds to the field, the data field given name, is contained by this span. There's a couple of other pieces of information that don't get contained in containers, and one of those is photos, right? The image tag just inserts an image. So what I need to do for the image tag is not to mark it up with this, because that's cumbersome. Instead, with the image tag, what I need to do is just apply the class photo to the image tag itself. Same thing with URLs, right? It may very well be that in the text of your page, if you want to indicate that the person you're talking about, and it's probably worth pointing out here that you can create an HCard for anybody that you're talking about on your web page. It doesn't have to be you. That for URLs, it's worth just applying the class URL to the A tag itself that creates the link. So what do we actually have here? We have a short personal information page where what I've done is embedded information about the person I'm talking to in a machine-readable way. I can then export a so-called V-card that I can import into my whatever I use for an address book, my email program, for instance. And this is what it looks like when you change it. There are also ways to make this more easily visible to people. But one thing that might be worth looking at here is with the operator extension, I can just indicate that I want all micro formats to be highlighted, and the new version seems to break it. Not so much. Well, it's a little less obtrusive than it used to be. But what you'll note here is that as I mouse over, it indicates that this is in fact a micro format that contains data. So there's a number of other considerations that are worth thinking about. Question, why bother, right? Again, this makes it immediately visible to pretty much any machine that's looking for identity information that this web page is in fact about a person. That is to say, when Google is parsing this, it's immediately visible that this person, whoever's being talked about, is a subject of discussion on this web page. Not necessarily the author of the web page, not necessarily an important person, but if you are looking for information about Patrick Mooney, then Google knows that this page is in fact about Patrick Mooney, and that helps it rank search results. If you have, and these are some minor notes actually, if you have full control over the HTML code of your page, then you should add a profile link to the heading of your document. So again, I told you that you would see the link element several more times today. What a profile is just a machine and human readable declaration of the vocabulary that's being used. You don't have to do this for it to get parsed properly by most parsers, but it's considered to be an additional hint from the machine. Remember that all you're really doing is pointing out to non-browser parsers where a certain type of information is. And remember that if you wind up with a lot of extra divs and spans, you can in fact leverage the fact that HTML rendering collapses white space. Another useful microformat, and one that I tend to overuse on my own web pages, is HCalendar. And this is perhaps a more directly relevant example of why you might want to do such things. Because when it comes right down to it, this is something that I do all the time for the sake of being helpful to my students. And in fact, if you take a look at my current section guidelines handout, I'm going to turn off the highlight microformats feature in a minute because I find it annoying. But you'll notice if I mouse over a whole lot of stuff on my web page that it's highlighting it, indicating that there is in fact encoded data there. What do you actually see if you look at my section guidelines handout with operator? Well, a lot. It may be helpful in the first place to just encode my information in a way that students can easily add to their address books, is one way to leverage this. For another thing, what else do I mark up here? Using the HCalendar microformat, I mark up everything that happens all quarter. I will be the first to say that this is probably overkill because it takes me about an hour to do every quarter. But what do I have? Every lecture, every time I have office hours, every discussion section, a number of events, course midterm, last chance to drop, all of that. But really, what is this? This is a convenience for the 2 or 3 tech-savvy students who can figure out how to do it, right? What can they do with this? Well, for one thing, they can just export the entire guideline, the entire calendar for the quarter, and then they can automatically import that into Google Calendar, 30 boxes, whatever desktop scheduling program they might use. This is a convenience. So, HCalendar, actually, I tend to use for pretty much anything that I'm talking about that's an event at all in any way. And in fact, you know what, I'm not even going to bother. I looked at this a couple of weeks ago and I estimate that I have about 700 different events marked up in various places on my website. So what do you do in order to mark up an event with HCalendar? Again, ideally you want to link to the profile in the heading of your HTML document. You can, of course, do this if you have full control over the HTML for your document, such as if you're writing your web pages from scratch. You cannot do this if you were using a blogging platform to write HTML, at least not anywhere nearly as easily. What you do is you find the information containing, or you find an element that contains all of the information, and you mark it up with the class vEvent, and then that vEvent, that element that contains the class vEvent, that element that has the class vEvent has to contain at least 2 other pieces of information. One is, when does the event start? And the other is, what is it? A human readable description. When the event starts, it's called DT start, and its description is called summary. HCalendar is a little harder to implement, and so is perhaps not the best microformat to start with, which is why I started with HCard. And that's because You have to indicate when an event starts. You optionally can indicate when it ends. But the problem here is that there are about 80 bazillion different ways to describe time in human natural languages, and that makes it difficult for machines to parse. So what you need to do is to indicate what time stuff starts in a machine-readable way, right? So what you might have here, if you're describing the reason I'm making this particular change is because H-Calendar, annoyingly, does not have a way to indicate that this event repeats every week on Thursday from 2 to 3. So if I want to mark up every office hour, I really do have to write a new H event, or a new V event for every office hour. But what I might do here is indicate that this paragraph contains all the information about the V event, the event that I'm marking up. You may notice that this paragraph occurs within a larger scale block that's already describing another micro format. That's perfectly fine. So what do I need to indicate? Well, first I should make it properly human readable, grammatically correct. I need to indicate what it is exactly that, which part of this is in fact the human readable description. The microformats standard for H-Calendar says that the description should be marked up with summary. Google also likes it a lot if you also mark it up with the tag description or with the class description. So I tend to do both. Again, you can have as many classes as you want in here. They're specified, or they're separated with spaces. And all I'm doing here is indicating that this is the end of the human readable description. Well, this Thursday from 2 to 3 is not a particularly machine-friendly description. So what I'm going to do is mark it up as DT start, which is the format for, or the class name for the date that the event starts. But not, instead of using the span tag, I'm using the abbreviation tag here. What I'm really indicating, and this is perhaps a small abuse of what the abbreviation tag is really for, but this is widely understood, is that this Thursday from 2 to 3 is actually a way of saying this. I'll just go ahead and type it. It goes in the title attribute. Good Lord, what is this Thursday? The 4th? No, the 5th. Okay, so I've got a date in here. This is a standard date format that the International Standards Organization says everyone should be using all the time when they are trying to communicate with machines. Ideally, we do it this way.
So you can very well use the span tag?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let me show you how I might do that. And then followed by the letter T, indicating the time of day, and then the 24-hour time. An alternate way of indicating this might very well have been if I wanted to type this out in exactly this way, then absolutely I can wrap it around with span tags instead. The problem is that many humans do not find this to be a natural way to express time. However, it's totally okay, and I think that most people understand it.
So the span tag makes those numbers apparent or invisible on the page?
Right. What it indicates is that this is the start date, DT start, for an event, whose description is my last office hour this quarter. But yeah, that's absolutely a perfectly legitimate way. Basically, what microformats standards say that you should do is find whichever element most logically already contains all of the information in question. And ideally, this would be the way that you did everything. The problem is that the 80 or 90 different ways to specify time in English are not easily machine understandable. Okay. What else can you put in a V event? Quite a bit, actually. And you'll notice that in this first example up here, one of the things that is included in the V event is the address from the H-card microformat that I had already encoded, and that'll get understood and marked up as part of the event as well. So again, it's not uncommon to have overlapping information where processing each individual microformat may pick up things from the other ones that you've already written. So we've talked a little bit about marking up events on a section guidelines handout. Just to kind of show my hand here, I'll show you the HTML for my section guidelines handout that I've been using this quarter and show you just how much effort is actually required to mark up all of the events that you use. So what am I doing here? Well, I'm marking up a lot of events at the top. I'll show you the rendered version of this so it's a little more intelligible. What do I have at the actual top of the page? I have a bunch of information. This is the section requirements and guidelines. Here we have the course name, the professor's name, the quarter, when the lectures are, when the sections are, right? What do? My own practice is that I try to put information if I'm hiding it. If I'm going to put hidden information that's not directly visible to the user, because you may notice that I've embedded a bunch of information here that doesn't ever appear in a human readable way. And if you want, I'll show you how I do that exactly in a couple of minutes. Yeah, I definitely have to stop highlighting things. So, but I mean, here's a bunch of information that it makes natural sense to mark up, right? It's already human readable information for the students in the class that gets printed out and handed to them at the beginning of every quarter. 18th of April, last chance to add a course. 6th of May, midterm exam, right? And so a real natural thing to do here is just to spend that little bit of extra effort to mark this up in a machine readable way, right? So what do? Well, this is actually a list. And again, notice how much I just skipped at the beginning. But a kind of a real minimalist way to start doing this might just be to mark up, if you have an important dates section on your section guidelines handout, mark those up as events. So what do I have here? LI class equals V event, right? Here I have that there's already an unordered list that contains a bunch of list items, each of which is itself an event. So what do? I just add the class V event to the LI tag for each one. Aber class DT start line header is just a formatting convention that I've decided to use on my own website. And what does it mean? Put it in bold. I just give a semantic meaning to put it in bold. And then use the Aber class 2014-048 T1600, last chance to add a course via gold. So I mark this up with an abbreviation, class DT start, and the machine readable date. Then I mark this up with summary and description, because Google loves you to also use description. But what I have here is the natural language description of the event is just surrounded with this band tag. Again, this is a real simple way to do it. If I want to add in all of my information that's not visible to students, what I try to do is add in a bunch of hidden stuff that is near where the human readable description is. So, so what do I have? Dates. So I have, for instance, what are my office hours? Tuesdays 2 to 3 and Wednesdays 3:30 to 4:30, or by appointment in South Hall 2432E. How do I mark that up? By creating a separate V event for each and every one of those individual 20 office hours that I have during the quarter. So yeah, here is the description of my office hours in human readable format. And then what I'm actually doing is abusing the use of various, of the abbreviation tags, right? What I'm doing is, here I have abbreviation date, abbreviation class equals DT start, title equals, here's my office hour on April 1st. What am I wrapping it around? A space. So there is no human readable text that I'm wrapping it around. And again, if I want to use the abbreviation tag for the description of what's going on, then I can do that again. Patrick Mooney's office hours, wrap it around a space, right? Then I have, when do my office hours end, which is, DT end. And that indicates that they end at 3 p.m. And again, wrap it around a space. And then I can use location to indicate South Hall 2432E. Again, all I'm doing is wrapping these around spaces, and you'll notice that despite the fact that you would expect that that would mean that there's a lot of spaces in the document after my office hours, of course HTML collapses white space, so there's one extra space in my document, which is not really visible. What else do I mark up? Well, good question. What else do I mark up? All of my office hours. I find it easier if I'm going to be doing this to break them. If I have 2 office hours a week, what I do is I go through and I mark up all the Tuesday office hours together, because that makes it easier to cut and paste and do small amounts of editing than all of the Wednesday office hours together, for the same reason. What else do I mark up? Well, there's a number of stuff that gets marked up here in the course requirements. You have to have a first paper due. I'll mark that up. That's the primary reason why they don't get marked up again down here. They've already been marked up. So yeah, where do I mark up each and every section that happens during the quarter? Generally where I talk about sections themselves. So at the top of the page, it says lecture Tuesdays and Thursdays 12:30 to 1:45. That's followed by 20 hidden V events. So yeah. Then it says sections for each one. Each of those is followed by 10 hidden V events. Really, it's pretty straightforward. There's a number of other things that you can, in fact, add to there. And there's a full list on microformats.org, which I could probably get to if I could spell it. But then I'd have to be getting more sleep than I have tonight. And here's the definition of H-card, and here's the definition of H-calendar. So here's all the things that you can put in an H-card. Formatted name, structured name, nickname, organization you work for, photo, URL, email, telephone. One of the things that is probably worth pointing out is that if you mark up your email or telephone on a web page at all, you will start getting spam emails and or junk phone calls. Address, birthday, if you want to add tags, if you want to add notes to the vCard, you can do that. Similarly for H-calendar, there's a number of different things that you can indicate about events. You must indicate when it starts and its summary. You can also indicate location, URL, when it ends, or how long it lasts. There are, in fact, now procedures for indicating that it repeats, although they're, so I did, in fact, oversimplify a little bit earlier, but they're not all that flexible, and I don't find them to be all that useful. You can indicate the latitude and longitude of the event. You can embed H cards indicating who's attended, any of that stuff. I think a legitimate question here is, once you've done all of this stuff and marked up all of these events and all of this identity information, how do you know that you haven't screwed it up in some way that will make it difficult for a machine to parse? And so the first response to that question is, well, ideally, you should always run it through the World Wide Web Consortium free web validator. Because if you're not writing valid HTML, then you're also not writing easily machine parsable HTML. So what I verified here is just that my section guidelines handout is valid HTML. I haven't yet verified that it's machine parsable in ways that, say, Google understands. However, one of the great resources that Google provides is what they call their structured data testing tool, which is to say, you can just type in, if it's already on the web, you can just type in the URL of it, or if you're still editing it and you haven't uploaded it yet, you can just copy it and paste it into this box, and then hit preview, and what Google will show you is what it sees. So what it's showing me here is, this is what a search result for this document would look like. If you're actually showing it on, if what you've done is actually typed in the URL and parsed that, you will sometimes get better results here for what the search result would look like. Then it shows you every single event that it's able to, that it's able to extract. And you'll notice that it'll complain if various things aren't happening correctly. What I want to emphasize at this point is that happening correctly from Google's perspective does not necessarily mean violating the HCARD standard. It just means Google doesn't necessarily like it. So let me get some more useful results there, actually. Or rather, just show you what it looks like when you're parsing a document that's already on the web. So here's what it would look like if Google were to display my discussion section guidelines as a search result. Google indicates that I've correctly indicated Google authorship for this website. I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's indicating here's all the microformats and other structured data we were able to extract. What's it complaining about here? The event start date is in the past. Is that actually an error according to the HCalendar standard? No, of course you can talk about events that have happened in the past on your website and that you can mark them up in this way. But of course they're less relevant to Google because most people who go through a Google search for information are looking for information about upcoming events rather than past events. So you can see if you go down through here that Google is able to extract a great deal of information from this website, including there are dates that appear on there that are in the future, and it's not complaining that they're in the past. What else is it able to extract besides events? Well, all my office hours. You'll notice it also parses the HCARD format and tells me what it's able to extract from that. And a bunch of other stuff. If you want to be really geeky about how your data is being processed, you will notice that if you do anything at all with RDF, it'll indicate how it's parsing the RDF. Even if you're not doing things with RDF, Google will sometimes tell you what it would be doing if you converted it to RDF. But moving along there. Last microformat we're going to be talking about is XFN, the Extended Friends Network. This is the first microformat, actually, and it's really simple. All it's used for is indicating relationships between people when you link to some of their content. Probably the single most by far the single most common thing that I do with this is to abuse it slightly, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second. But all I have to do to indicate or to be properly using XFN is to, when I link to somewhere, let's see here, where do I have a link on here? Class equals URL, here it is. So here's a link to my Google Plus profile. I've added class equals URL here because that makes it that indicates that this is part of the H card and that this is my website. At the same time, if I want to, I can indicate to parsers that this is another representation of myself somewhere else on the web. Adding this doesn't make it part of the H card. Adding this indicates my relationship within the XFN vocabulary. There's no reason there's no reason why I can't do both. What is this actually for? Well, again, it's helpful when you're thinking about your online presence management to indicate to machines that are parsing your documents what your relationship is to other pages on the web, and in particular, where else you are on the web. So by far the most common thing I do with this is indicate that another web page that I'm linking to is also a representation of me. You can actually do a lot more with XFN than that if you want to. I just don't find a reason to do it very often. So really all you have to do is add rel for relationship equals something meaningful to your links that you're adding. Theoretically, you should be using this to talk about your relationship to a real human being when you link to a web page that represents them, right? Their blog, their Facebook profile, their LinkedIn profile, their Google Plus profile, something that they wrote. But the page should theoretically be a representation that talks about the person's identity. I abuse the shit out of that all the time by using rel equals me for anything that I point to that's in any way related to me. But there's a number of things that you can talk about, and the initial proposal for this indicates, you will note, indicates a number of things that I never talk about on the web at all, right? But, and you know, nor do I necessarily talk much about my family or my neighbors on the web. But the initial idea is that software that's spidering, crawling through the web, should be able to pick up something about why you're linking to someone else. There are plenty of other things that you can do with rel equals values, and there's a number of non-competing rel equals vocabularies that you can use that we're not going to be talking about. But you will, all I'm trying to point out here is that if you look at source code for other websites, you will see rel equals values being used to do a lot of other things. Talking about some ways that you can be nice to Google. And what I'm doing here is actually using Google to mean not just Google the search engine, but also as a sort of a representative sample of all search engines that process web pages. And so what I want to suggest is that being nice to Google and telling Google explicitly how you want your information to be processed is a smart move, because it helps your pages be processed in ways that help other people. And so I would like to suggest too that Google, being the world's most popular search engine by far, other search engines follow Google's practices. That is to say, if you make yourself intelligible to Google, you are also going a long way towards making yourself intelligible to Bing and Yahoo. So I'm using Google in a sort of an expansive sense here to mean primarily Google, but also other search engines. So there's a number. I guess one thing that's worth thinking about here is to say, how does Google actually decide what search results to display? And the short, technically correct answer is that's a trade secret, right? Like, Google does not tell you exactly what what criteria it uses, or it doesn't by any means give you a comprehensive list. There's a great deal of information about what Google actually does, and there's also an even vaster volume of speculation about how Google does this. And if you want to take a look at the links for this seminar, you can find one that is 200 different criteria that Google uses to decide web page rankings. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Of those 200, maybe 60 or 70 are certain, and the other 130 or 140 are conjectural to some degree. But if you think about it, what is it that people, why is it that Google would keep their information secret in the first place? Well, because Google is the world's most popular search engine, because it does a pretty good job of finding pages that people want when they type in queries, right? And so how does it do that? Well, there's a number of ways. One is that it looks at the semantic structure of your document. And again, this is yet another reason why you should be designing semantically instead of presentational, because all of the semantics that you indicate will provide Google with hints. But the primary reason that Google doesn't want to give out an exhaustive list of exactly how their algorithms work is that in order to remain a useful service to the people who are using it to search, they don't want shithead web developers trying to game the system excessively. So there are people who have made their careers out of search engine optimization, which basically means gaming the system to try to get your results closer to the top. One thing that I think is worth indicating at this point is that there is a common myth that people say that, you know, if they're talking to, say, a search engine optimization person, they say, I want to be on page 1 of Google. This already encodes a misunderstanding about how Google and other search engines work. There is no page 1 of Google. There is a page 1 of Google under various circumstances. And so one of the things that Google does, too, is it uses whatever it knows about you to try to provide you with the most relevant search results. And what Google knows about you is incredibly expansive, right? Even if you sit down at a library, at a computer in a public library or internet cafe, it already knows some basic information about you that helps it serve you more relevant search results, right? If you go to Google and you search for Amazon, chances are you will get one of the Amazon.com companies, but which one you get depends on which country you're in, right? If you are searching for Amazon in the UK, you'll get Amazon.co.uk as a higher ranked search result than Amazon.com, which is the US company. This makes sense to users, right? Similarly, if you are searching for for anything really, from an academic institution, then that skews or from a computer that's connected through an academic institution, that skews your results towards more academic search results. If you are logged into your Google account, man, Google knows all kinds of things about you from your past searches and your Google Plus profile and anything that you've done that's in any way related to a Google service. They have vast amounts of data on you that they use to try to leverage to provide you with what they take to be the most relevant search results. Again, this is pretty useful for most people most of the time, despite the fact that some people have privacy concerns about it. But what I want to point out here is simply that there is no page 1 of Google. There is only top, higher and lower ranked results, but this can be skewed by any number of factors. So how is it that you provide useful information to Google? Again, one way is just to use microformats, to mark up things that you find useful, because Google will in fact treat that as useful information when displaying search results. So here's my spring discussion section guidelines. You'll note that it's picking up on stuff from microformats that is not human readable in the web pages, right? Like those, like we were looking at later. English 133 SO lecture. The fact that that happens on June 3rd, that I have office hours on June 3rd, that there's a discussion section on June 4th. None of this appears marked up as such in a human readable way on the document. And that's really all I wanted to point out. So there's a number of ways that you can indicate to Google that you are the author of this document in a way that is meaningful to Google. And again, taking a look at one of my existing documents, Um, you'll notice that I put an awful lot of stuff in the header of my document, much of which I'm not going to be talking about today. But one of the things that you'll notice is that I used the meta name, the meta tag, to use author as the keyword and Patrick Mooney as the value of that keyword in pretty much every document that I write. In fact, my intent is to use it in every document that I write. What does this actually tell Google? Not much. There's 60 or 70 other Patrick Mooneys wandering around the country. So this isn't helpful to Google in a way that just pointing to my Google Plus profile is. And so that's what I do here. I add a link, rel equals author, with an href attribute that just points to my Google Plus profile. That helps Google mark it up as and display it as being from me. And that's why, by the way, if you don't type in a very restrictive search, you'll get a photo that in Google search results for my web pages, you'll have a photo here and it'll be linked to me. It'll say by Patrick Mooney, and it'll be able to link to various other stuff. Basically, all Google wants is for you to do two things. It wants for you to point at your website from your Google Plus profile, and it wants you to point back at your Google Plus profile from some link in the document in a way that also indicates rel equals author. So what does that actually mean? Well, I'm already pointing at my Google Plus profile here, right? And I already have rel equals me. I might as well just add author to that. If I'm then pointing at this website somewhere from my Google Plus profile, I've just established authorship for Google. And it'll be able to figure that out. Again, all I'm really doing is giving a hint. And again, there's two ways to do this. You can use the link HTML tag in the head of your document, or you can use a standard link somewhere in the actual document body itself that points to your Google Plus profile, and then add question mark rel equals author to the end of the URL. A more complex way of giving hints to search engines, and hints of different kinds to search engines, is to use a so-called sitemap. And what I want to say here is that you will see the phrase sitemap used to describe a human-friendly overview of the structure of a website a lot of the time, right? And this is a common link that you'll have where you'll click on sitemap, and what you actually get is, here is a kind of a tree structure, the overview of the site, right? There's an About Our Company section, which contains these pages. And then there's an Our Products section that contains these pages. I'm not talking about human-readable sitemaps here, but rather machine-friendly sitemaps, which are just a way of providing hints to search engines about how your documents should be ranked relative to each other and what should be crawled. So there's really three main issues that get addressed here. Where are files that a search engine might not already find? And how often should search engines check for document updates, right? And also, how should various documents on your own website be ranked relative to each other? This sounds like a complicated kind of issue, actually, but really it's not. All you're really doing is providing a set of related hints to search engines. So what do? You create an XML file called sitemap.xml at the root of your site's directory. What's XML? It's just another markup language that looks a lot like HTML, but doesn't have a fully standardized vocabulary. XML vocabularies always depend on their context. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So here's a sample sitemap that I use for my own website. Or actually, this is an excerpt from the sitemap that I use for my own website. You will notice that it looks a lot like HTML in a lot of ways. It starts out with URL set and ends with closing the URL set tag. Then each URL that you're talking about in the sitemap opens with a URL tag and closes with the URL tag, and contains at least one other piece of information, which is always the location, right? So what's the location of this particular document that I'm pointing to right now? It's the top level document on the website, my home page, right? And you'll notice again, what is the actual vocabulary of the tags in XML? XML is incredibly flexible. It can be whatever you want it to be. So you can define XML tags to say URL, location, change frequency, priority, whatever. But what you're doing here is just pointing to a machine-readable schema that indicates what the legal vocabulary for this XML document is. So what do? I give the address of a document that I'm talking about. I talk about how often I want the search engine to assume that that document changes. There's a number of standardized responses, which are things like daily, weekly, monthly, I think yearly, although maybe it's annually. Also, always and never. Always means the search engine should assume that it changes every time that it's loaded. Never means it will never change again, it's an archived document. And then priority, on a scale of 0 to 1. How high do you want the search engine to treat this page on your site relative to other pages on your site? So, I mean, if somebody searches for me, I want my homepage to be a fairly high priority on the search results. On the other hand, if I have a miscellaneous document that says, here's what other people did on this website, and it says, I used this button from this website that says I used valid HTML, that's probably not most people's highest priority when they're looking for me. Sitemaps were developed collaboratively, believe it or not, by 3 competing search engine companies. And pretty much every search engine understands the kind of hints that they give. So Google, Bing, and Yahoo are all collaborating on this standard. Again, it's pretty simple. All you really have to do is use this vocabulary to describe pages on your website. You do not have to describe every page on your website. You just have to describe pages that you want to indicate in some way. So why might you want to do that? Because you want something to be treated as very high or very low priority, because it changes a lot or never, and or because the web crawler might not find it on its own. So if you have documents on your website that aren't linked to from other documents on your website, it's not a bad idea to point to at least one of them in a way that will help this, at least one document in that linked set that will help the web crawlers find all of them. You can't use a sitemap to increase or decrease someone else's website's priority, right? You can only use a sitemap to talk about documents legitimately that are on the same domain as the sitemap itself. Which makes sense. You don't want a bunch of people deciding that their competitors' websites should get a lower priority and trying to decide, trying to indicate that to search engines. One of the golden rules for dealing with search engines is never try to trick them. Because despite the fact that I've been talking about them as simplistic children, they're actually pretty sophisticated at trying to detect that. And so trying to game the system in any way is always going to, well, it's not always going to hurt you, because people have made careers out of trying to game the system on behalf of other people. Arguably, a cynical view would say that's what search engine optimization is. But the search engines are getting pretty sophisticated at detecting when people are trying to trick them. And basically, if they detect that you're trying to trick them, that you're being dishonest, they punish you by lowering your ranking. Why? Because they want to discourage anyone from doing that in the first place. So, if you want to do a bunch of other useful stuff, or if you want to go to Google or Bing and say, hey, there is definitely a sitemap here, please take a look at it and tell me if you find any errors, then you can sign up for Google Webmaster Tools, and Bing also has a Webmaster Tools page that is kind of annoying and requires that you do special things in order to validate that you are the webmaster. Then it'll give you all kinds of useful information about what it's noticing about your website. So, taking a look at information about the website that I have Google Webmaster Tools tracking gives you all kinds of information about what's actually going on. So, one of the things that Google is currently telling me is that I'm abusing my sitemap, right? That I'm indicating stuff in there that it's not actually able to index or that it's not appropriate. Why? Because sometimes I'm pointing towards stuff that is a text file, is something that I noticed recently I shouldn't be doing. It'll tell you about how often you've been searched for. Apparently, I've turned up in search results for 299 separate queries, and I've been displayed in one way or another 9,971 times. People have clicked through 654 times since May 5th. Probably most of those people are looking for another Patrick Mooney, or I'm turning up in response to other things. But it'll tell you any number of things about what's going on with how Google is processing your website. How many total documents does Google have processed for me? 224. That's about 100 less than I actually have. So some of my documents are not being indexed, probably because they're similar duplicates of other documents, right? My section guidelines handout looks a lot alike every quarter. But again, that's something I can look into later. I think the last thing that we'll probably be talking about, because we're getting short on time, is Open Graph, which is just a way of indicating some meta information that social networks find particularly helpful here. And again, you will notice that if you log into Facebook, Facebook being our primary example of any social network under any circumstances, because it is the most common one. That if you go to share a URL, let's find any website. Sure, this will work. That's actually not what I want to be sharing. Okay. Anyway, let's click through so as not to get Google's referral link. It's so hard to resist that urge to check those 4 notifications since this morning when I logged in. That if I share something, a URL on Facebook, what Facebook does is it retrieves the URL and tries to get information about the document. My discussion section guidelines handout does not currently have Facebook-friendly markup, Open Graph markup, but Facebook is still figuring out a number of things about it, in part because I'm marking up my document semantically, right? That it can figure out that this is the title of the document, and because I use the summary or description meta keyword, it's repeating that too, and then it indicates what domain it's coming from. You can control a fair amount of how this looks, this bit here in the Facebook kind of card that they're using to describe your document. Yes, I want to leave the page. And the way that you do that is by adding a bunch of meta tags, is the short version. That's what Open Graph is. You have a set of meta tags that you put in the head section of your document. If you omit it, Facebook will make reasonable guesses, especially if you're writing good markup anyway. Facebook is the originator of this standard, but because everyone has to follow Facebook's lead, because if you're only designing for one social network, you're almost certainly designing for Facebook. Other social networks understand Facebook's vocabulary. That includes LinkedIn and Google+, and to a certain extent, Twitter and Pinterest, although they also have their own vocabularies. Twitter and Pinterest are particularly annoying to design for, I think, because unlike Facebook, they require that the Twitter company or the Pinterest company approves your website before the markup starts working. So how do you actually use this? You add a bit of verbiage to your root HTML element, right? What is this? This is just an indication that when you have meta tags starting with OG, that this is the machine readable version of how you parse them. Alas, this technically breaks validity for any HTML document other than that's written in a version of HTML other than HTML5, which is the emerging and more complex standard. However, even if it's technically invalid and doesn't work in the it causes the W3C's validator to complain, it still works just fine, and your documents are still parsable by pretty much any machine, because most machine processors are more tolerant than the W3C's validator. That's the point of the validator. It complains about any little error. In order to be minimally compliant with the Facebook, the Open Graph standard, I should say, you have to indicate 4 different tags. You have to indicate the title. Even though your title is already encoded in the title tag in your heading, you have to indicate it again. It can be different. It probably shouldn't be wildly different, because again, machines are getting better at picking up on when you're trying to trick them, and they don't like it. You have to indicate what type of thing you're talking about there. Quite often, if you're just writing a web page, the Open Graph object type will be website. But there's a number of other things that you can put in there, like audio or video. You have to put in the URL of the document that is being described, even though you would think Facebook could automatically infer that from the fact that somebody is pasting the URL into the box. There are technical reasons for why that's it, including that the short version is that documents can have multiple URLs, and you can think about that as there are multiple ways to get at a document on many systems. Facebook wants you to always have a canonical URL so that they can track every reference to it, no matter how someone got there. And you have to include an image that can be used as a thumbnail. There's a bunch of other properties that you can control. Did I get that right? Good. I can type occasionally. Anyway, this is the technical description of the Open Graph standard. So here are some other things that you can put anywhere. OG:audio, Open Graph audio. Well, I mean, when I post the audio file that I've recorded during this presentation, that's something that I can put in there. OG description, a 1 to 2 sentence description of your subject. Locale, EN_US. What language is it being in? There's a number of other ways that you can describe various types of things, if that's what your web page is in fact about. So if you're writing up an essay on a picture, then you might want to describe your web page as OG:image. Or if your web page is primarily centered around a video, you might want to describe it as OG:video. And then there is, in fact, a whole bunch of stuff that you can talk about for various kinds of stuff, various kinds of things that you're describing. Yeah, so that's the quick rundown on Open Graph. Again, Twitter and Pinterest also understand Open Graph, at least to some extent, and so do Google Plus and LinkedIn. So talking a little bit about how do you increase your search engine ranking. What do? You write HTML that is in the first place valid. Google loves that. You can break validity in various small ways, and it's sometimes worthwhile to do so in order to achieve something that can't be achieved validly. And one of the major examples there is if you want to, say, embed a Twitter image, or a Twitter widget is what I'm trying to say. That is not the URL, in fact. But if you embed one of these Twitter widgets, which I think is occasionally a handy thing to do, that the code that Twitter requires that you use breaks validity. I think it's worthwhile to break validity in small ways in order to get things like this sometimes. So all I'm really trying to indicate, there are some ways, in some places where there's no reason not to break validity, but think about why you're doing it. Engage in good semantic markup practices. Put meaningful values in your header tags. Put meaningful meta information in the header of your document in ways that machines can understand using standard vocabularies. Using microformats helps Google to process, and again, other search engines, to process your web pages in various ways. Check the validity of your document using the W3C's validator. You can use the Google Structured Data Testing tool, and Facebook actually also has a debugger that indicates how Facebook will show your open graph information. Apparently I don't know my own password anymore. Awesome. So if I want to see how Facebook is parsing one of my web pages, I can use the Facebook debugger to see what Facebook will get out of it. And you'll see this is what Facebook will display if somebody shares that link on a web page. So check the validity of your documents using whatever tools are appropriate. Never try to deceive search engines. A good way to think about increasing the visibility of your web presence is to treat a website that you build personally and have full control over the code for as a central hub for your online presence. Link back to it from your other online presences, your Facebook profile, your LinkedIn profile, your English department grad student profile, your profile on Flickr, or anywhere else that you have a place online. Use that as a way of linking back to your central web page, and then from somewhere on your central website, link back to all those other places, or as many of them as you're comfortable with. This process of reciprocal linking is the single best thing that you can do to improve your search engine ranking, honestly, without paying some slime bag to try to deceive Google. The more sites link to your website, the more valuable a resource Google sees it as being. Again, unless you are doing things that are intentionally deceptive, like spamming blogs with links. And use good metadata to describe your site. So after spending 2 hours talking about how you can do a bunch of other stuff that requires you to do extra work in order to do nothing that's directly visible to users, I think it's a fair question to ask how much of this is actually worthwhile. The answer is it all depends. The question is, what do you want? And what it comes down to is what benefits you're trying to bring to yourself and to the visitors to your webpage. Again, I think that a reasonable, oops, I didn't even mean to hit the key. I think that a reasonable response is to say that you might legitimately, use microformats to describe yourself briefly using the H-card markup on any page that has your name on it. You might also use the H calendar standard to mark up quickly at least major events that you're talking about for your students. And if you anticipate that something that you have created is likely to be shared on a social network, you may want to use Open Graph to talk about it. But the short answer, I guess, is you should do whatever you're most comfortable doing, whatever directly brings you and your viewers benefits. Questions? Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pack up then.